"Leftovers aren't a real job," my dad said, then laughed. My brother smirked across the table. "That's a dumb idea." I stayed quiet. I looked down at my bowl of rice and pretended to be very interested in the grains. No one asked what I was building. No one even looked up from their plates. The conversation moved on like I had said nothing at all, like I had commented on the weather instead of sharing something I had been thinking about for months. The dinner table was the same one we had always used, same chipped edge on the corner where my brother had dropped a pot lid when he was 12, same overhead light that flickered when someone stood up too fast, same smell of rice and soup that meant family more than food ever could. My dad sat at the head of the table, shoulders squared, posture rigid. In that way men learn when stability becomes their armor. He believed in degrees, titles, clocks that punched in and out on time. Work to him was something you could explain in one sentence to a neighbor without feeling embarrassed. Something respectable. Something normal. My brother scrolled on his phone between bites, half listening, half present. He worked at an accounting firm downtown, wore pressed shirts, drove a car our parents had helped him buy. He was practical in a way that looked like confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from walking paths already paved by other people. My mom moved between the stove and the table, placing bowls down quietly. She didn't say much. She rarely did when conflict hovered in the air. Silence was her way of keeping the peace, even if it meant leaving things unresolved. And then there was me. Lydia Thompson, the one in the family who never quite fit into the sentences people like to finish for you. I hadn't planned to bring it up that night. I knew better than to introduce fragile ideas into rooms where certainty ruled. But someone asked what I had been busy with lately, and the words slipped out before fear could stop them. "I've been working on something," I said. "It's about reducing food waste. Leftover food from bakeries and restaurants, connecting it to people who need it, or selling it at a discount before it gets thrown away." That was as far as I got. My dad laughed, not cruelly, not loudly, just enough to end the conversation before it could begin. "Leftovers aren't a real job," he said. My brother didn't even bother looking up from his phone. "That's a dumb idea. Who's going to pay for old bread? No follow-up questions, no curiosity, no why or how or tell me more." The conversation simply moved on like I had mentioned a passing thought instead of something I had been researching for months. I stared at my bowl and nodded, pretending I agreed. It wasn't the laughter that hurt the most. It was the absence of interest, the way my idea disappeared into the room without leaving a trace. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I had grown up understanding the rules of this house: practicality over possibility, safety over curiosity, get a stable job, save your money, don't take unnecessary risks. These were the commandments of my childhood, repeated so often they felt like natural laws rather than choices. Still, some small part of me had hoped for a pause, a single question, something like, "Why leftovers?" or "What made you think of that?" Instead, there was silence, then a conversation about my brother's promotion, then questions about whether I was still dating that nice accountant from church. Later that night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment again and again. I wondered if I should have explained better, if I should have used numbers statistics logic, something that sounded more respectable. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't have mattered. The idea didn't fail because it was unclear. It failed because it didn't fit into the version of success they trusted. That was the night I learned something important. When you choose a path that doesn't exist yet, you shouldn't expect applause. Sometimes you won't even get acknowledgement. I didn't decide to prove them wrong. That kind of motivation burns fast and leaves nothing behind. What I decided instead was quieter, heavier, and far more durable. If they couldn't believe in it, I would believe in it long enough to see what happened. The idea hadn't come from ambition. It came from observation. Every night on my walk home from my part-time job at a coffee shop, I passed a small bakery on the corner. Right before closing, the staff would bring out large trash bags, heavy ones, and drop them into the bin behind the shop. One night the bag tore open. Bread spilled onto the pavement. Still warm, perfectly edible. Croissants and baguettes and rolls tumbling out like they meant nothing. I stood there longer than I should have. Across the street, a dimly lit apartment block housed families who counted every dollar. I knew because I had grown up near places like that. Hunger didn't always look like empty plates. Sometimes it looked like stretching meals, skipping seconds, pretending you weren't hungry so someone else could eat. Food wasted on one side of the street, food needed on the other. I started asking questions no one seemed interested in answering. Why did this make sense? Why was this normal? And most importantly, could it be different? I spent nights reading about food waste in other countries. I found stories of platforms in Europe experimenting with surplus food, apps that sold surprise bags at a discount, community groups that redistributed excess instead of discarding it. Nothing was perfect, but the idea that leftovers could be value, not shame, kept showing up. That was the word that stayed with me. Value. Not charity, no pity. Value. What if leftovers weren't something you hid, but something you redesigned? What if they weren't symbols of excess, but opportunities for efficiency, access, and dignity? I didn't tell my family any of this. After that dinner, I learned to keep my thoughts folded neatly inside myself. I went quiet not out of resentment, but out of self-preservation. Explaining too early can be dangerous. It exposes fragile ideas to hardened opinions before they've had time to grow roots. 3 years later, standing in that crowded business hall, I didn't feel victorious. I felt disoriented. The lights were bright. Conversations overlapped. People spoke in the language of metrics and growth and scale. Words that once intimidated me now floated by like background noise. When my dad's friend leaned in and asked that question, "Why didn't you ever tell me your daughter runs that $150 million company?" I watched my father's face change in real time. Confusion, surprise, something close to disbelief. He didn't look proud at first. He looked startled, as if the story he had been telling himself about me no longer worked. That night when my phone lit up with his name, I let it ring, not out of spite, not as punishment, but because I wasn't ready to compress 3 years of silence into a single conversation. There would be time for that later, because this story didn't begin with success. It began with laughter at a dinner table, and before there could be understanding, there had to be work. It didn't look like a startup. No logo, no office, no pitch deck, no angel investors, no business cards, no elevator speech rehearsed in front of a mirror. Just a secondhand motorbike I bought for $300 from a guy who was moving to Texas. A few cracked plastic crates I begged from a nearby convenience store. A pair of gloves that still smelled faintly of detergent. And a stash of reused plastic bags I collected from my own groceries. My uniform was a dust mask, a hoodie, and worn-out sneakers. If someone had taken a photo of me from afar, they might have guessed I was a late-shift cleaner. Honestly, that's exactly how I felt most nights. Like someone hired to clean up the parts of the world no one wanted to acknowledge. I remember the first night clearly. It was past 10 at night when I parked outside a small bakery 2 streets from my apartment. I had walked by it enough times to know their closing hours. I also knew just from watching that their unsold pastries didn't make it to morning. They went into black trash bags tied up tight, tossed behind the back door. Still warm, still edible, still wasted. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The closed sign was already flipped and the lights had dimmed. A woman was stacking trays behind the counter, humming to herself. I paused at the door, rehearsed my line one more time, then walked in. "Hi, sorry to bother you. If you have any leftover pastries tonight, would it be okay if I took some?" She looked up slowly, confused at first. "Then be cautious. You mean for yourself?" I nodded. I was too embarrassed to explain the full plan, too afraid she would laugh at me the way my family had. She paused, then half smiled, half winced. We usually just toss them. But I guess I can give you a few today." I thanked her awkwardly as she wrapped 3 croissants in a paper bag. She slid it across the counter without making eye contact, like she was worried someone might see her doing something unusual. That walk home was the heaviest one I had taken in a while. The croissants smelled sweet and buttery, but I didn't feel proud. I felt ashamed. Ashamed that I hadn't said what I was really doing. Ashamed I had accepted her half-skeptical look. Ashamed that I was trying to make something out of what the world had already decided was worthless. But then I passed the alley behind the bakery and saw it. A garbage bag split open. 3 whole loaves of bread lying on the pavement like discarded ideas. That was the moment I turned back. Over the next week, I visited 2 more shops. One gave me their extras without hesitation, even tossing in a few sandwiches that were still cold from the display case. Another told me flat out we don't want the risk. What if someone gets sick and blames us? I didn't argue. I just thanked them and walked away. It wasn't the rejections that cut deepest. It was the looks, suspicion, pity, amusement, as if I were scavenging for myself. As if this was some elaborate excuse to avoid a real job. I wanted to disappear every time someone called me the leftovers girl or handed me a bag like they were donating to a cause they didn't believe in. Still, I kept collecting. By week 2, I had enough to try something new. I split the food into smaller packages, labeled each with the pickup date, and added a sticker I printed at home on my cheap inkjet printer. Collected fresh, still good until blank PM. I filled in the time with a black marker, wrapped each package like it was a gift. If I didn't treat the food with dignity, how could I expect anyone else to? Then came the real wall, distribution. I started with the obvious, a local park where unhoused people often stayed. I offered a wrapped sandwich to a man sitting alone near a bench. He shook his head. "No thanks. It's still fresh," I said gently. He looked at the label, then at me. "Still looks like trash to me." Another woman waved me off, muttering, "I'd rather be hungry than eat what someone else threw away." I wasn't prepared for that. I thought people would be grateful. I thought need would override pride. But I was wrong. In a society obsessed with packaging and status, even survival had its hierarchy. People didn't just want food. They wanted to feel safe and respected when receiving it. Back home, I sat on the floor, surrounded by unclaimed boxes. I was exhausted. I hadn't told anyone what I was doing. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't even have a plan beyond the next night. That night I wrote in my journal, "If this is going to work, I need to learn how to deliver trust, not just food." So I started learning. I watched YouTube videos on food safety. I asked a friend studying microbiology about storage timelines. I bought a secondhand cooler box from a garage sale. I redesigned the labels. I changed the wording from leftovers to rescued meals. It felt more intentional. More hopeful. The next week I returned to the same park. This time I handed the same man a tightly sealed package. "This one's from a cafe that sells out by lunch most days," I said. "They had extras today." He didn't reply, but he took it. 2 days later he asked me, "You got any of those cinnamon rolls again?" I smiled. There were still many who refused. Still many who said no, even when hungry. But a few began to recognize me. A janitor working night shifts asked, "Do you have anything soft?" "My teeth aren't great." A delivery driver said, "Thanks for last time." It reminded me of when my mom used to bake. None of these moments were viral. None made it to social media. I didn't take photos. I didn't post updates. I was too afraid someone would ask, "Who do you think you are?" But inside something was shifting. Each small connection stitched a little more belief into what I was doing. A bakery owner began texting me before closing. "We have a few extras tonight. Swing by." One time a woman, who had previously refused, now waited near her gate when I passed. It wasn't successful. Not yet. But it was enough to keep going. I had no capital, no co-founders, no roadmap, just a motorbike, a few crates, and an ache in my chest that wouldn't go away every time I saw a full trash bag behind a shop. Most days, I didn't know if what I was doing mattered. But some nights when I rode home with empty crates and a full heart, I thought maybe this is what the beginning looks like. Not grand, not loud, not certain. Just a girl with a trash bag trying to build something the world didn't know it needed. I used to pray for more bakeries, more extras, more chances to prove that this messy little idea had legs. And when it finally came, when the tide started coming in, like a tide, I couldn't stop. I realized how unprepared I was. The first sign was the texts. 1, then 2, then 8 bakery owners started messaging me in the evenings. "We have a few trays left tonight. Can you come by? Or do you want today's sandwiches? They'll go in the bin otherwise." At first I was thrilled. I remember dancing around my room after picking up from 4 shops in one night. I felt like something was finally working, like all those awkward conversations and skeptical looks were finally paying off. But then came night 6. I had collected 37 pastries, 2 bags of baguettes, leftover quiches, and more than a dozen croissants. My crates were full. My motorbike sagged under the weight. I had only brought enough bags for half. I tried to rush home, resort, and come back. But 2 of the bakeries had already closed by the time I returned. I lost their trust that night. They stopped texting. What I thought was growth felt like slipping. There's a strange irony in getting exactly what you wanted and realizing it's too much to carry. Literally, I wanted to cry but was too tired. I went home, stared at the uneaten sandwiches on the kitchen floor, and whispered, "You asked for this." The guilt of not distributing them on time sank into me. That was when I knew. If I kept doing it alone, I wasn't just failing. I might start resenting the very thing I cared about. I was the collector, the sorter, the delivery person, the label writer, the social media updater, and the cleaner. I kept a spreadsheet in my head. My arms ached. My sleep was broken. I was burning out quietly. And no one knew because I hadn't let anyone in. One day, a friend casually said you should start charging the shops a small pickup fee. I shook my head, too fast, too defensive. "It's not about money," I said. "If I charge, people will think I'm profiting off waste, off charity." But even as I said it, I heard the fear in my own voice. I wasn't rejecting the idea. I was afraid I didn't know how to build anything that wasn't held together by idealism. A week later, I found myself searching online. Social enterprise, food recovery business model, nonprofit sustainability. Every result led me to the same uncomfortable truth. Sustainable doesn't mean free. It means repeatable, scalable, survivable. If I wanted to help more people, I had to stop thinking like a helper and start thinking like a builder. So I began to ask new questions. What's the part of this I do again and again? Could I teach someone else to do that? What if bakeries signed up on their own instead of me messaging them? What happens if I'm sick for a week? Does everything fall apart? The problem wasn't just about food anymore. It was about time structure and flow. I wasn't running a rescue mission. I was managing an invisible supply chain with no tools, no team, and no systems. So I started small. I asked 3 friends to help on weekends. They said yes, excited at first. One of them was Evelyn Thompson. We had met 2 years earlier at a community cleanup event, both of us picking up trash along the riverbank, while everyone else took photos for social media. She was the only other person who stayed until the sun went down. Rachel worked as a social worker during the day, but her nights were her own. When I told her about the food rescue idea, she didn't laugh. She didn't ask if it was a real job. She just said, "When do we start?" We even gave each other silly team names. One called herself the Bread Whisperer. Rachel insisted on being the Croissant Commander. Another designed a little sticker logo for us. But by week 3, one dropped off. Then another. "Work's been busy," one said. "It's really great what you're doing, though." I didn't blame them. But Rachel stayed. She was the one who showed up every single weekend without excuses. While others faded away, Rachel remained. She had a way of talking to bakery owners that I didn't have. She was warm where I was awkward, confident where I was hesitant. By the end of the first month, half of our partner bakeries had been recruited by her, not me. I never asked her why she cared so much. I was just grateful she did. I realized I had asked for help without giving direction. There was no map, no clarity, just my stress leaking into their Saturdays. Volunteering worked, but only for a while. It wasn't a structure. It wasn't dependable. That night, I sat down and wrote one sentence at the top of my notebook. If I were to make this a real thing, what would I call it? I stared at the page for half an hour. Then I wrote a name. It wasn't brilliant, but it was a start. I mocked up a basic logo using a free online tool. I created a simple online form titled Food Recovery Partner Sign Up. I made a sheet to track pickups and deliveries. I even set a rule: no more last-minute bakery runs. Everything had to go through the form. It was clunky, manual, messy. But it was a shift. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was designing. I didn't call it a startup. I wasn't ready. The project felt safer, less pressure, less need to explain. And yet the universe has a funny way of responding when you take yourself seriously, even just a little. A friend from college, now doing her MBA, stumbled across my initiative on social media. She messaged, "Are you the one doing this food recovery project?" I told her. "Yes," a little embarrassed. She said, "I just showed this to my professor. He thinks you're building something really interesting." "Wait, what?" She called that evening. "Have you thought of selling some of the rescued food to farms as compost input or animal feed? What about making subscription pickups for cafes that want to reduce waste but don't have time? Are you tracking how much food you've diverted from landfills?" I was stunned. I hadn't thought of any of that. Not really. I had been too deep in the doing, too close to the mess. But that conversation cracked something open. For the first time, someone was looking at my work not as a good deed, but as a model. A living, breathing system that could grow. That could impact more than just my 2 arms worth of delivery routes. She even helped me build a basic tracker to measure pounds of food recovered each week. We made graphs, we had data. And data told a story. This wasn't just kind, it was effective. That night I opened the fridge to get a bottle of water and caught a glimpse of one of our rescued packages. It had a label, a sticker, a timestamp. It wasn't just a bag of bread anymore, it was part of something bigger. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept wondering, am I good enough to do this for real? What if I'm not organized enough, not smart enough? What if I'm just someone who's good at picking up crumbs but not at building the table? That question sat heavy on my chest, but instead of turning away, I wrote it down. Can I really turn this into a business? I didn't know the answer. Still don't. But I know what I did next. I kept building. Quietly, clumsily, determinedly. Because maybe this whole thing didn't start with a pitch deck or a loan. Maybe it started with one girl, one trash bag, and one night too many watching good food go to waste. And now it needed more than a trash bag. It needed structure, people, tools, maybe even a little funding. It needed someone willing to stop surviving night by night and start scaling something that could outgrow her. And I was finally ready to try. The email arrived on an ordinary morning, the kind where nothing feels like it's about to change. I was sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment back against the wall, sorting through yesterday's leftovers, labeling what could still be shared, what needed to be discarded, what I had to apologize for wasting. My phone buzzed. One vibration, then silence. I almost ignored it. When I finally glanced at the screen, the subject line stopped me cold. Proposal. Waste Management Collaboration. From Greenbake Chain. For a few seconds, I just stared. I read it once, then again slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less absurd. 17 branches across the city. Hundreds of kilograms of surplus food every day. They had been watching what I was doing. They wanted to know if I could collect and process surplus food according to the model you've been operating. My first thought wasn't excitement. It was suspicious. Surely they had the wrong person. I checked the sender's address, the signature block, and the company website. Everything was real. Too real. My hands started shaking. Not from joy, but from the sudden weight of being seen. The moment I walked into their office a week later, I knew I was out of my depth. The lobby smelled like coffee and polished wood, not damp cardboard and plastic bins. People moved with purpose, clipped badges to their shirts, spoke in calm, measured voices. When the receptionist smiled and said, "They're expecting you," founder, the word hit harder than any insult ever had. Founder. I had never called myself that. I was someone who rode an old motorbike at night, knocking on back doors, asking for what others threw away. Now I was sitting across from 3 executives in tailored suits, answering questions I had never prepared for. How do you guarantee hygiene standards? What are your time commitments? Do you have a scalable model? How many kilograms can you process daily? They weren't mocking me. They weren't curious for entertainment. They were serious. Painfully serious. I nodded, took notes, answered honestly. When I could, admitted when I couldn't. Inside, a voice kept whispering, "They're going to realize you don't belong here." The days leading up to the formal meeting felt like a blur of panic disguised as preparation. I gathered the same friends who had once helped me carry crates and sort bread on sidewalks. Rachel was the first to arrive, carrying a bag of markers and a stack of poster boards. "We need to look like we know what we're doing," she said, "even if we're terrified inside." We spread papers across the floor, argued over words like capacity and risk, tried to turn lived chaos into something that looked like a system. I made a simple proposal. Objectives process timelines, current limitations. I designed slides late at night, squinting at my laptop screen, wondering if the font choice would expose me as an amateur. Rachel was the one who insisted we print uniforms. She was the one who stayed up with me until 3 a.m, rehearsing answers to questions we hoped they wouldn't ask. When I started spiraling about fonts and slide transitions, she grabbed my shoulders and said, "They're not investing in your fonts. They're investing in you." I didn't believe her, but I pretended I did. We printed cheap uniforms, plain shirts with a logo that still felt too new, too fragile. We weren't a real startup, not yet, but we decided to act like one. If this was a test, we would at least show up prepared. The meeting itself was quieter than I expected. No grand speeches, no dramatic interruptions, just listening. They asked detailed questions about logistics, storage, and transportation. I explained how we worked, where we failed, what we were still learning. At one point, one of them leaned back and said, almost casually, "I like this model. It's not perfect, but it's very human." Another nodded. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "We're willing to pilot this with 3 branches." My chest tightened. 3 branches meant 5 times the volume, 5 times the risk, 5 times the chance to collapse. I smiled, thanked them, walked out with my legs barely holding me up. The pilot phase nearly broke us. The workload exploded overnight. Collection schedules overlapped. Storage ran out faster than expected. One evening, a batch of pastries dried out because we miscalculated the timing. Another day, a customer complained about an odd smell. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Every mistake felt fatal. I imagined the contract being canceled, the polite emails turning cold. When I finally called their representative to explain a problem before they discovered it themselves, I braced for disappointment. Instead, she said, "We've been in this industry for 10 years. We don't need perfection. We need people who fix mistakes." That sentence stayed with me. It was the first time someone on the other side treated failure as part of the process, not proof of incompetence. A month later, they signed a 6-month contract. 6 months. A real timeline. A real commitment. They introduced me to another partner. They posted about the collaboration on their social media, calling it a green partnership. I stared at the post longer than I should have. Not long ago, I had avoided familiar streets while carrying leftover bread, afraid of running into someone I knew. Now a national chain was publicly associating their brand with my work. The contrast felt unreal. I wasn't collecting trash anymore. I was providing a solution. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought pressure. Expansion meant people systems technology, things I didn't have. It meant money, real money. For the first time, I couldn't pretend passion alone would be enough. As I locked up that night, exhaustion settled into my bones. One thought kept circling back. I had proven I could sit at the table. Now I had to learn how to stay there. The morning sunlight felt different after the green bake deal. I walked into the storage room where crates of saved bread and pastries waited, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was scrambling just to catch up. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something bigger, but that edge was terrifyingly steep. The contract with Green Bake meant we were handling more than 300 kilograms of food every day, but the space we had, the trucks we borrowed, the volunteers who showed up when they could, none of it was built for that scale. I remember thinking that night, cleaning crumbs from the floor, that passion might get you noticed, but passion alone wouldn't keep food safe, or trucks on the road, or bakers confident enough to hand over their surplus. And that was when the whisper started. You need capital. You need funding. I had always hated talking about money. Growing up, it felt like a stain on pure intentions, and passion projects were supposed to be untainted by spreadsheets, budgets, and return on investment. But when you have a real contract with real expectations and real food in your hands every day, you quickly learn that money isn't a nice to have. Money is endurance. Money is trust. Money keeps the freezers running and the lights on. And so I began to learn about something I had never understood before, raising funds. I didn't know what a pre-seed round was. I didn't know how seed differed from Series A. Terms like burn rate, customer acquisition cost, cap table. They sounded like a different language, like an advanced game, where I didn't even know how to roll the dice. I spent nights reading articles that made my eyes glaze over, watching videos where founders used jargon like a second skin, tapping into online forums where startups shared their war stories. Every attempt to learn felt humbling, like I was rewriting the foundation of how I thought about work itself. I opened a presentation program for the first time in a context that wasn't just labeling food bags. I stared at a blank canvas titled Pitch Deck Version 1, hands shaking slightly, and typed problem, solution, market, then deleted it all because it was meaningless without numbers. So I learned how to draft a business model canvas. I made spreadsheets where once I only had sticky notes. I learned to estimate costs, project revenues, and forecast growth concepts that felt alien next to memories of sorting bread at midnight. Eventually, I had something that sort of looked like a pitch deck. I chose simple designs, clear wording, and honest assumptions. No buzzwords, no illusions. And then I wrote the email that made me feel both proud and nauseous. Clicking on a message to a startup funding event's organizers, attaching my pitch, and praying it wouldn't bounce back. When it didn't, my stomach was a knot of anticipation and dread. The day of the pitch event arrived like a tidal wave. I wore a blazer that somehow made me feel both professional and fraudulent. On the stage, the lights were brighter than I expected. The room was packed with people who seemed to breathe business strategy as naturally as breathing. I had 10 minutes. 10 minutes to tell the story of a woman who once collected leftover food from bakeries, leaned on a borrowed crate and borrowed hope, and now managed significant volumes for a real chain. I spoke about impact, about volumes, about how our system had evolved. But when the timer beeped, I was barely halfway through the technical details. The question and answer session was worse. The questions came rapid fire. How will you scale without technology? Who is on your team? Where is your chief technology officer? What's your customer acquisition cost? What's your exit strategy? I answered as best I could, but each question felt like a spotlight on my weaknesses. They were not interested in my story. They wanted data. They wanted certainty. They wanted numbers sharp enough to cut through doubt. When it was over, I stepped off the stage and sat down with a hollow feeling, like I had shown up in flip-flops to a formal dinner. And then came the investor feedback session. One man, mid-50s, looked at me kindly, but with professional distance. "You're solving a worthy problem," he said, "but this is not a scalable business as it stands." He paused. "I don't see how you'd grow this into a repeatable model that justifies investment." He didn't throw it in my face like a rejection tweet. He simply didn't see potential. It was ice water running through my veins. I didn't feel sad in the way a child feels sadness. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like the universe was asking if I had been dreaming all along. But then he said something that cut deeper. "Come back when you know exactly how much you need and what you will do with every dollar." He wasn't dismissing me. He was telling me I hadn't done my homework. That stung more than I expected. The event ended for me without an offer, without applause, without new doors opening. I walked out wondering if all my work had been for nothing. And then, alone on a bench outside in the twilight, a wave of clarity washed over me. I realized the problem wasn't the idea. It was that I had pitched my heart instead of my head. Investors don't invest in emotion. They invest in confidence, in planning, in execution, in predictability. I had passion, but I lacked structure. I had an impact, but I lacked a plan convincing enough to invite money in. So I decided to take a month off from fundraising. Not to retreat, but to learn. And this time, I was going to learn with intention. I closed my laptop and opened books on financial modeling. I watched lectures on startup finance. I reached out to other founders who had survived this brutal initiation. Slowly, the language of investors stopped sounding like gibberish. I learned to write a realistic budget. I learned how to forecast a cash flow statement. I learned that financial clarity isn't cold. It's essential. During this time, unexpected supporters emerged. People who weren't angel investors in the traditional sense, but believers in other ways. A longtime customer of our food pickups offered $50,000, not as charity, but as a partnership contribution to help us scale pickups. Rachel was the one who made it official. She had been with me from the beginning, but now she agreed to join full-time as co-founder, taking charge of operations. She quit her social work job to do it. I told her she was crazy. She told me she had been crazy since the day she met me at that riverbank cleanup. With Rachel handling the day-to-day logistics, I could finally breathe. She knew every bakery owner by name. She remembered their kids' birthdays, their favorite coffee orders, the little details that turned business relationships into real ones. The partners trusted her in a way they didn't trust me yet. I had the vision. She was the heart. And a local cafe offered storage space for our overflow on slow days. I remember thinking how odd it felt. Money didn't come from typical sources. It came from trust built through relationships, not valuations. And that was the lesson. I didn't need someone to rescue the project with a fat check. I needed people to believe in its viability. Money without belief collapses. Belief without structure endures. Sitting at my desk one evening, surrounded by notes and spreadsheets, I wrote one line in my journal. No one invests because they feel moved. They invest because they trust in the plan behind the feeling. That became my mantra. I wasn't good at finance yet. I wasn't a persuasive fundraiser, but I was learning. I wasn't great at pitching, but I could speak from experience, honesty, and clarity. And as I prepared for the next round, not with desperation but with strategy, I realized something important. I wasn't going to ask for money anymore. I was going to invite partners to believe with me. Fundraising ceased being a plea. It became a conversation. And that change, small, subtle, yet profound, was the real turning point. I arrived at the cafe with no slides, no pitch deck, no rehearsed elevator speech. Just a mug of black coffee warming my hands and the faint taste of nerves on my tongue. A friend had texted me the night before. "You should meet Howard. He's easy to talk to and has invested in a couple of sustainable projects." I treated it as a courtesy call, something I would go to politely and dismiss. But now, seated at a small table bathed in warm morning light, I wondered whether I had underestimated the moment. He walked in a few minutes late, casually dressed in a soft sweater and jeans, broad-shouldered but with a gentle gait. He smiled when he sat down and didn't offer a handshake. Just leaned in and said, "So tell me what keeps you awake at night." I had expected questions about revenue projections or logistics bottlenecks. Instead, his first question was almost personal, and somehow I found myself talking about rejection, about the echoes of no that still followed me from startup events, from investors from the world that kept telling me to scale or fail. He listened without interruption, eyes steady, body relaxed. After a long moment of silence, he asked, "Why are you still doing this, even though people have told you it won't work?" The question wasn't intimidating. It was a mirror. I paused, considered the weight of his words, then replied with the truth. Because every time someone refuses to take a leftover meal, I see their fear of waste more than their hunger for food. That answer wasn't polished, but it was honest. He nodded slowly, not as if evaluating me, but as if acknowledging someone's humanity. Then came the question that caught me completely off guard. If I gave you one person, one system, and one chance, what would you build with it? He wasn't asking about valuation or market share or break-even points. He was asking about trust, about vision, about intention. Those were questions I hadn't asked myself yet, not in clear, defined terms. Before we drank the last of our coffees, he had already pointed out 3 blind spots in my model. The first, my entire operation relied heavily on manual labor and goodwill. Without a system to automate, track, and analyze pickups, we would always be fighting yesterday's inefficiencies. The second, there was no technology backbone to monitor inventory retention, delivery compliance, or quality. We were reactive, not proactive. And the third, our message reduce waste was technically correct, but it lacked emotional resonance. It didn't tell people why this mattered to them. "You're doing something good," he said gently, "but if you want to go far, you need to do good the right way." I braced myself for the part where he said he would invest. Instead, he said something that felt far more valuable. "I don't invest in your business idea. I invest in people and the way they think." Then he laid out his proposal. He wouldn't write a check right away. He would offer something else first. I'll give you one mentor, one CTO on a part-time basis and access to my network. Show me consistent progress over the next 3 months, and then we talk about actual funding. 3 months. It sounded like a test, not a reward. I wanted to say no. I wanted to say I would prove myself without needing someone else's help. But something in his calm certainty made me nod. A small leap of faith, one that felt riskier than anything I had done before. And in the 3 months that followed, everything changed. The CTO he introduced me to was a quiet force of engineering discipline. Within weeks, we had a dashboard that tracked orders, pickups, retention rates, and delivery times. What used to take me hours of manual sorting could now be visualized in real time. It saved us nearly 40% of operational time and reduced spoilage. The mentor, meanwhile, reframed our narrative. "Stop talking about waste," he said. "Talk about delicious food at great value, communities fed with dignity, environmental impact turned into personal benefit." It was like flipping a switch. We redesigned our messaging around a concept called surprise bag, a playful, engaging offer that turned surplus into a treasure hunt for consumers. Each bag cost between $3 and $5 and contained food worth at least $15. You never knew exactly what you would get, but that was part of the appeal. The language changed from depressing jargon to something lively and inviting. Eat well, save money, help the planet. In team meetings, I began to sense a shift in myself. I was no longer just someone who patched leaks. I was thinking like someone who managed a vessel, learning where it creaked, how to reinforce it, how to set a course forward. The months passed, each one marked by incremental victories and occasional setbacks. We tested different delivery windows, improved packaging, and gauged customer feedback. Slowly, patterns emerged. The model became more than a story of compassion. It became a repeatable, measurable solution. After 90 days, we sat down again at that same cafe where none of this had ever felt real before. I wasn't alone. My CTO and mentor were there. Rachel sat beside me, her notebook filled with partner feedback and operational notes. I opened my slides with data. Customer retention reduction percentages, cost savings, projected growth curves. The language had shifted. It was no longer "please believe in us." Here's what we've proven. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then my mentor smiled. "Now we talk about the real opportunity," he said. And that's when it happened. The commitment letter arrived, not just a nod of interest, but a genuine angel investment. $150,000 to scale what we had built. I stared at the figure on the contract, hardly able to believe it. This was more than capital. It was trust. Someone willing to put real skin in the game, because they saw not just the model, but the person behind it. I finally understood what my friend meant when she said this meeting would be worth taking. And as I signed the final line, the weight of the journey so far crystallized into one simple truth. I no longer felt like someone fighting to be seen. I felt like someone recognized me. That damn coffee meeting had done more than introduce me to new people. It introduced me to a new version of myself. I wasn't the lone collector anymore. I was the founder of something scalable, strategic, and meaningful. And for the first time, I believed deeply that I could play in the arena where meaningful ideas meet real resources. The world had stopped seeing me as just a dreamer with leftover bread. They saw me as someone building a company, with vision, with strategy, and with the right kind of backing to go further than I had ever dreamed possible. And that made all the difference. Everything was finally moving in the right direction when the post appeared. We had expanded into 2 new cities, hired people I once could only afford to dream about, and moved into a cramped but real office that smelled like coffee cardboard and ambition. A sustainability magazine had just run a feature on us with a headline that made my chest tighten in disbelief: the startup turning food waste into urban impact. Partners congratulated us. Volunteers from the early days sent messages saying they felt proud to have been there at the beginning. For the first time, growth felt steady instead of fragile. Then late one evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. Her text was short. "You need to see this. I'm sorry." I clicked the link, not understanding why she was apologizing. Then I saw the post. It was from a well-known environmental group, one I had admired long before I ever started this company. The title was sharp and unforgiving. They accused models like ours of legalizing profit from trash, argued that leftover food should be given away, not sold, and implied that companies like mine were exploiting morality for revenue. The comments multiplied by the minute. Shares climbed faster than anything we had ever achieved organically. What cut deepest wasn't the anger, it was recognition. Many of the people questioning us had once been supporters, volunteers, early users, who believed in what we were doing. I stared at the screen and felt something hollow open in my chest. I had always prepared myself to be criticized by skeptics. I had never imagined being attacked by those who spoke my language, who claimed the same values. For the first time, I wondered if the world saw me not as someone trying to solve a problem, but as an opportunist who had simply learned how to wrap profit in purpose. My initial reaction was ugly and human. Anger came first, sharp and defensive. Didn't they know how many nights we spent fixing mistakes? Didn't they understand the cost of logistics, safety, accountability? Fear followed close behind. What if partners pulled out? What if stores didn't want their brand associated with controversy? I sat up late drafting a long response, explaining our entire process from sourcing to pricing, from hygiene protocols to reinvestment strategies. I pressed publish hoping clarity would quiet the noise. It didn't. The post sank under the weight of new comments that barely referenced what I had written. People weren't looking for explanations. They were looking for something simpler, a reason to decide whether to trust us or not. Some comments landed like small knives. You used to give food away, now you sell it. Another startup pretending to be ethical. If it's truly about people, why charge anything at all? Each line felt personal, even though none of them knew me. Inside the office, tension thickened. We called an emergency meeting that stretched late into the night. The room was divided quietly, but clearly. One group argued we should scale back, go silent, and wait for the storm to pass. Another wanted to fight back published data, push a stronger PR campaign, prove everyone wrong with numbers. A few people said nothing at all, staring at the table, their energy drained by a battle they hadn't signed up for. Rachel sat in the corner unusually quiet. When I caught her eye, she gave me a small nod. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. I listened, taking notes, nodding, but inside, I felt the weight of a role I had never fully carried before. This wasn't just my idea under attack anymore. It was the morale of 20 people who had trusted me with their time, their careers, their belief. For the first time, I didn't feel like a founder reacting to criticism. I felt like a CEO responsible for trust, inside and out. When the room went quiet, I said the only thing that felt honest. We're not going to win this by being louder. Heads turned. I continued choosing each word carefully. If they think we're wrong, we should let them see what we actually do, not our words, our work. The decision felt counterintuitive and risky. Instead of counterattacking, we reached out to the group that had criticized us and invited them to visit our operations. The message was simple and public. We said we were open to changing if we were truly wrong, but asked them to see the process before judging it. We scheduled an open walkthrough and announced a live stream that would show everything. Pickup sorting safety checks, distribution, customer delivery, no filters, no editing. The days leading up to it were exhausting. We cleaned, documented, double-checked every step, not to perform perfection, but to avoid hiding anything. During the live stream, cameras followed our team from early morning routes to late-night packaging. Viewers watched gloves being changed, food logged, timestamps recorded. We explained why some food couldn't be donated freely, why systems were necessary to keep people safe, why sustainability without structure collapses under its own idealism. Comments rolled in as we worked. Some were still harsh, but others shifted in tone. Questions replaced accusations. Curiosity edged out contempt. Afterward, something unexpected happened. A few members of the original group sent private messages. They admitted the model was different from what they had assumed. One said, "I still have concerns, but I respect that you showed everything." A week later, another environmental organization reached out proposing a joint campaign on responsible food rescue that combined free distribution with sustainable pricing. What began as an attack turned into a conversation, then into collaboration. The crisis didn't disappear overnight, but it transformed. Our model became clearer, not just to the public, but to ourselves. Trust couldn't be bought with advertising or built with clever messaging alone. Good intentions meant nothing if people couldn't see accountability. Doing good work wasn't enough. You had to communicate it clearly, humbly, and consistently. I also learned something quieter but deeper about leadership. Being right was less important than being responsible. Listening mattered more than reacting, and fear, when faced directly, could be turned into alignment instead of retreat. By the time the noise settled, our community was smaller but stronger. The people who stayed believed not because we claimed virtue, but because we demonstrated it under pressure. I no longer feared misunderstanding the way I once did. I understood now that growth attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny tests integrity. When you survive that test, you don't just protect your company, you define it. We were no longer just a group collecting leftovers. We had become part of a broader conversation about ethical consumption, about dignity, about how good intentions scale without losing their soul. And just as I began to breathe again, thinking the worst was behind us, a new challenge surfaced, one that wouldn't come from the outside world, but from within. The message came late at night, pinging on my phone with the abruptness of something important and personal at the same time. I unlocked the screen and saw her name at the top. Rachel. My stomach dropped before I even read the words. Rachel never texted this late unless something was wrong. She was the early morning person, the one who sent voice memos at 6 a.m. while walking her dog. A late-night text from Rachel meant bad news. The message read simply, "Can we talk tomorrow? I didn't sleep much that night." I kept thinking about all the times Rachel had been there. The riverbank cleanup where we first met. The first bakery ran when she showed up without being asked. The 3 a.m. rehearsal before Green Bake when she grabbed my shoulders and told me they weren't investing in my fonts. The day she quit her social work job to join me full-time. 3 years of showing up, and now a text that felt like a goodbye. I replayed the crescendo of the past months in my mind. From the early days of collecting leftover pastries one block at a time, to signing with Green Bake, to drafting a pitch deck that almost made my knees shake, to meeting Howard in that cafe and transforming the way we built this thing. I thought about how far we had come, and then I thought about how delicate it felt, like a paper boat sailing on water that could turn choppy at any moment. I should have known that growth wasn't a straight line. I should have known there would be a storm that didn't come from outside critique or investor scrutiny, but from within. The next morning, I met Rachel in the small conference room we now used for internal check-ins. She was quiet, her eyes tired, and before I even said anything, I could tell this wasn't a casual chat. Then she said it. "I think I want to leave the company." The words hit me with the suddenness of a door slamming shut. In that moment, all the coordinated metrics and strategic plans and external support faded. What stood in front of me was someone I trusted, someone integral, saying she no longer felt she belonged. I blinked, trying to absorb it without reacting too fast. Why, that was all I managed at first. Rachel took a breath like she had rehearsed it for too long. "I feel disconnected from the pace, from the direction," she said. Her voice was steady but tired. "I miss the early days. Do you remember when we used to deliver bread ourselves, when we knew every single person who received a meal? Now I spend my days in spreadsheets and conference calls. I joined this because I wanted to help people, not manage systems. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that systems help more people than 2 women on motorbikes ever could." But I knew what she meant. I felt it too sometimes late at night when the numbers blurred together, and I couldn't remember the last time I had handed a meal to someone directly. "The world we built together feels corporate now," Rachel continued, "distant from the simple mission that brought us here. Help people, not build a company." She paused. "I need to find that feeling again, and I don't think I can find it here anymore." There was no anger in her voice, just a quiet resignation. "I want to explore other ways to make a difference. I'm not sure this is the right fit for me anymore." The silence that followed was heavy. I suddenly realized that leadership wasn't just about managing external forces. It was about holding the fragile threads of people's purpose too. Every growth chart, every contract, every investor email. Had I been so focused on outward milestones that I forgot the interior worlds of the people beside me? I sat there, words forming and unforming in my head, and the room felt too small. The first thing that came out of my mouth wasn't a plea to stay or a rational attempt to negotiate. It was honest. Thank you for telling me. I'm sorry you feel this way. Rachel looked at me with surprise. Perhaps she expected disappointment or a push, but I wasn't angry. I was already thinking about her, her journey, her contribution, the fact that she had given so much time, energy, and heart to a project that was no longer feeling like home to her. I asked her what she needed next, and she said softly, space, freedom, a chance to explore the kind of work that rekindles my own purpose. That was when I realized the moment wasn't a loss, it was a transition. I didn't tell her to stay. I didn't offer her stock or a title. I offered her understanding. What if we find a way for you to help shape this next chapter from a different angle? She paused, meeting my gaze. Maybe, but I think I need to step away first and see clearly on my own. She left a little while later. Not with drama, not with bells or fanfare, just a quiet closure. And that was the hardest part. Standing alone in the conference room, watching the door close on someone who had been beside me for so long. The next few days were strange. The office felt emptier. People didn't know how to talk to me about Rachel. Some avoided eye contact. Others overcompensated with forced cheeriness that made my stomach churn. But Rachel's departure created a real problem I hadn't anticipated. She had been the one handling relationships with our original bakery partners, the small shops who had trusted us from the beginning. She knew them by name. She knew their stories. Without Rachel, those relationships became transactions instead of connections. Within a week, 3 of those partners stopped returning calls. Mrs. Patterson from the corner bakery, who had been with us since month 2, sent an email saying she was reconsidering the arrangement. She didn't say it directly, but I knew what she meant. She had trusted Rachel. She wasn't sure she trusted the company without her. We lost 15% of our pickup volume. The team scrambled. I found myself back on the motorbike some nights doing pickups I hadn't done in over a year just to keep relationships alive. That evening, I sat at my desk, flipping through old photos of us during the early pickup days. Crates on the sidewalk, messy gloves, laughter with volunteers, Rachel grinning at the camera with flour on her cheek. I realized I had been chasing the future without honoring the past that built this future. I drafted a note to the whole team. It was not a press release about Rachel's transition. It was not a cold corporate explanation. It was honest. I wrote about change, about how growth sometimes means people have to find their own paths, about how gratitude does not require permanence. I wrote that every contribution mattered, that every person shaped this company, and that transitions do not negate the value of what was built together. I posted it on our internal channel, not knowing how it would be received. Responses came slowly at first. Thank you. Reflections? Even some vulnerability about people's own fears of change. Then something shifted. A sense of collective grounding. We were not broken. We were recalibrating. A few days later, one of our senior team members asked me for coffee. She said, "I understand why Rachel left, and I want to help make sure our culture holds purpose at its core as we grow. But we also need to fix the partner problem. I have some ideas." From that conversation grew a plan. We created a dedicated partner relations role, someone whose entire job was maintaining relationships with our original bakery partners, not just managing logistics. We started a new mentorship circle within the company, regular check-ins, not about KPIs, but about purpose. And slowly we rebuilt. 2 of the 3 partners who had gone silent came back. Mrs. Patterson called me personally after I visited her shop with a box of her favorite tea and an apology. The 3rd didn't return, but we found 2 new ones to replace them. The challenge of leadership wasn't just building structures to scale. It was holding the fragility of people's hearts while navigating those structures together. Startup life wasn't linear. It wasn't about conquering every external criticism. It was about weathering internal shifts without losing sight of why this all began. Rachel had chosen her path. I had to choose mine. And in choosing mine, I didn't isolate myself. I leaned into the possibility that companies can be places where purpose, not just profit, is tended with care. I walked out of the office that night thinking not about the loss of a co-founder, but about the wisdom the transition brought. Sometimes the greatest test of leadership isn't surviving attacks from the outside world. It's keeping the flame of internal trust alive when the ones closest to you decide to walk a different road. And in that test, we found no fracture, but growth. The email came on a Tuesday afternoon, just as I was sorting through logistics plans for the next city expansion. It was from a retail chain's CEO I had met at a sustainability forum. A straightforward subject line that made my stomach flutter. National Expansion Partnership Proposal. I clicked it quickly, hard in my throat. He wrote that his company had 300 stores nationwide and they were interested in integrating our food recovery model into their operations. More than that, they wanted to discuss scaling across multiple regions with shared branding, unified logistics, and potential market exclusivity. I stared at the screen long before the words sank in. This was everything we had been building toward, not just being the local solution, but influencing national systems. For a moment, I allowed myself the thrill of imagining our platform on every major map interface with teams and control centers tracking pickups and deliveries in real time. But when I leaned back and exhaled, a different thought crept up, faint at first, like a whisper beneath the roar of opportunity. At what cost would this growth come? For weeks after that email, I couldn't sleep properly. I replayed every conversation, every milestone, every step that had brought us here, from the first piece of leftover bread to the pilot with green bake. I confessed my anxiety to a close colleague over coffee. "This could be huge," she said, eyes bright with possibility. "But are you worried about losing what makes us us?" I nodded, more uncertain than I cared to admit, because deep down, the expansion wasn't just about more users or more cities. It was about identity. Who were we becoming? I opened the proposal document again and noted the key requirements. The retail chain wanted us to standardize everything. Data reporting, differentiated pricing tiers, contract terms that shifted some decision-making to their central office, removal of the term surprise bag in favor of a more corporate label, and most significantly, integration of our core model into their proprietary logistics infrastructure. In practical terms, this meant trading parts of our flexibility, our autonomy, and some of our original ethos for reach. Then I read the clause that made me wince. We were no longer calling it leftover food rescue. We had to use inventory optimization for commercial distribution. It was sterile, detached from the human connection that fueled our earliest days. In the quiet hours of the morning, I found myself writing lines I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I'm not sure this is what we started for. For the first time in months, I didn't feel excited. I felt wary, and that was unfamiliar. I called a company-wide meeting the next day, when the team gathered, their faces lit with expectation. Expansion meant job security, publicity, new roles, and I realized just how high the stakes had grown. I walked them through the proposal line by line while watching expressions shift from anticipation to concern and back again. Someone asked about branding, another about logistics. Then someone far quieter asked the question I had been tiptoeing around. Are we going to be doing something we regret? The room went still. I didn't have an answer yet. The next morning, I drafted an email to the retail CEO requesting a phone call instead of another round of documents. When he agreed, I breathed deeply and dialed. "I've reviewed your proposal." I began, my voice steady but internal nerves like electric currents. "And I appreciate the scale of what you're offering. But I have concerns about how some requirements would alter the core mission of our model. I want to talk about alignment first." For the next hour, we discussed definitions, identities, and purpose. He spoke in measured terms. Growth, market strategy, branding power. I spoke of impact, dignity, and community obligations. At the end, he paused and said, "We want to grow with you, not over you." I didn't celebrate. I assessed. I left the call with both hope and caution. That evening, I convened a smaller leadership group, mentors, the CTO, and a few trusted senior members. I laid out the opportunities, the concerns, and then the unspoken tension. If we incorporate too much of their structure, who are we? One wise voice in the room spoke softly but clearly. Don't decide from fear, decide from vision. For the first time, the question felt less like, will we lose something, and more like, what do we truly stand for? We spent hours defining non-negotiables: transparency in all operations, dignity for recipients, named surprise bags, not corporate jargon, decentralized choice of beneficiaries, an advisory council that included community voices, not just corporate executives. We drafted a counterproposal. It wasn't just a list of conditions. It was a value manifesto, the philosophical backbone of what we would and would not do, no matter the size of the partnership. The next call with the retail CEO was the most raw, real negotiation I had ever been part of. "We value reach," I said, "but we value identity more." I outlined each principle. There was a long silence. Then he said, "If we can meet at the intersection of scale and soul, let's build that path together." That night I sent the counter-proposal. I expected resistance. I prepared for rejection. But the response, tentative, respectful, curious, felt like the first handshake between two entities trying to define a new model of growth that didn't swallow identity. A week later, the retail chain's leadership sent back a revised offer. Shared branding only at flagship locations, a dual-track logistics option that preserved our independent routing for local partners, an agreement to keep surprise bag as a featured term in customer communications. They had not only accepted our manifesto, they had adapted parts of their own playbook to accommodate it. I stared at the email for longer than I should have. More than numbers or contracts, this moment affirmed something deeper. Growth didn't have to come at the expense of identity. Compromise wasn't surrender. It could be evolution with integrity. That night I wrote in my notebook, "Growth is not about being bigger, but becoming truer." We didn't sign the contract right away. We took time to align, refine, and involve the Community Advisory Council. The final agreement wasn't a surrender to scale. It was a blueprint for ethical expansion in an industry too often driven by brute force and bottom lines. Standing alone on my balcony late that evening, I looked at the city lights blinking in the distance and felt the weight of it all. We were no longer a scrappy team with borrowed crates. We were a company that had learned to define itself, not just react to opportunity. I didn't know what the future held. Expansion still felt like stepping onto a path with unknown twists. But for the first time I felt confident, not because of potential reach, but because of the purpose that had been tested. Not just by outside voices, but by our own willingness to demand better from growth itself. And that made all the difference. I didn't know exactly when he arrived. One moment I was surrounded by charts, dashboards, and campaign strategies. The next, in the middle of a crowded sustainability conference hall, I saw him, a familiar silhouette in the sea of unfamiliar faces. It was my father standing near the refreshments table with his arms loosely folded, eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for someone he used to know. I stopped mid-step, my breath caught in that strange space between recognition and disbelief. For years I had avoided bringing my work home, had shielded presentations, certificates, press mentions, and partnership announcements as though they were fragile pieces of a life he might never understand. And now here he was in a place that had once seemed impossibly distant from our dinner table discussions, the same table where he once remarked that my dreams were nothing more than childish fantasies. The first thing I noticed was that he wasn't laughing. Not then. Not at the sight of me navigating the hall with industry leaders, partners, investors, and activists, all nodding politely in my direction. He just watched, quietly observing, like someone trying to see the person I had become without judgment or expectations. His presence hit me differently than any victory, any signed contract, or any successful pivot we had pulled off in the last months. It wasn't a triumph. It was something warmer, slower, and far more personal. At a break between panels, he approached me. "You've been busy," he said, not as a critique, not as a question, simply as a statement. I nodded, unsure whether to ask how he got there or why he bothered. He smiled. Just a tiny shift of lips, but in that half-smile was nostalgia, curiosity, and something like pride fighting its way through years of silence. "I heard your name mentioned a few times," he said. "People seem to think you're doing important work." He didn't say good work or successful work, just important. That was enough. Later, we found a quiet corner outside where the chatter of the conference faded into a low hum. I told him about the evolution of the company. The first bakery pickups, the chaos of scaling the strategic negotiations, the ugly fights with identity versus expansion, the media storm, Rachel's departure, the new manifesto, the partnership with the retail chain. I could feel his gaze steady on me. Steady, not in judgment, but in the concentrated attention of a man finally seeking to understand rather than to be convinced. For a long time, he didn't say much, just listened. And that too was different. Back when I first pitched the idea at our dinner table, he had laughed, not maliciously, but dismissively, the kind of laugh that springs from a lifetime of believing some dreams are too flimsy to survive the daylight. Today he didn't laugh. He said I tried to imagine what it would be like, turning leftovers into something more. But I couldn't see it. I don't know if I get it now, but I see you. I see what it means to you. Now I'm proud. Now I told you so. Just I see you. His words felt like the closing of a circle I didn't fully realize was incomplete. So I said gently, uncertain, but compelled what changed. He looked at me, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the hallway lights. I didn't come to criticize, he said slowly. I came because I heard people talking about your work, not just what you do, but how you do it. That distinction struck a chord deep inside me. For so long I had imagined he would only come around when I achieved unassailable success, revenue numbers, awards, media glory. But what moved him wasn't the poster child version of success. It was the how, the integrity with which I had navigated complexity, the humanity I had insisted on keeping alive even when faced with scale, criticism, growth, and pressure. Later that evening, we walked through the conference lobby together in silence. Not awkward, not tense, just present. The noise of announcements about innovation labs and funding contests buzzed overhead, but it felt distant, like background music to a conversation we were having with our own histories. Then, with a hint of a smile, he said something simple, something that landed in my chest with a weight that was oddly light. You've built something real, not rich, not successful, just real. Real meant authenticity. Real meant integrity. Real meant I had survived not by sheer luck, not by corporate maneuvering, not by the numbers alone, but by holding true to the messy human heart of the idea that started it all, to take what society discards and make it matter again. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I thought about all the nights I had spent sitting with my thoughts while the world slept, about the times I had wanted to quit, about the phone calls unanswered, and the moments of doubt that threatened to unravel everything. I remembered the first scraps of bread that had sparked all of this, and how far we had come since then. Finally, I said, I don't know if I could have done this without losing sleep or without learning to see value where others saw waste. His gaze was steady, thoughtful. Some lessons come through struggle, he said. The world tends to teach you what you need to learn, not always what you want to hear. We stood there, the crowd ebbing and flowing around us, and I sensed a shift, not just in him, but in myself. There was no fanfare, no dramatic applause, no confetti falling from the ceiling. Just a man who once didn't understand, and a daughter who had worked in silence for years, finally meeting in a space where words of acknowledgement were possible. We walked back inside together, side by side, and in that moment, it felt less like a return and more like a beginning. The next day I took the stage again, this time without the weight of unspoken judgment pressing on my chest. My talk wasn't about statistics or projections. It was about why I started, the people I had met along the way, the moments when it felt like the world was against us, and the quiet, powerful force of persistence rooted in purpose. I spoke about the torn trash bag that first caught my attention, about the man in the park who said my food still looked like trash, and how that rejection taught me more than any business book ever could. About Rachel, who believed in me before I believed in myself. About the online attack that nearly broke us and how transparency became our greatest weapon. I didn't use slides. I didn't need them. The story was enough. When I mentioned the $3 surprise bags that now fed thousands of families each week, there was a murmur in the audience. When I talked about the bakery owner who cried the first time she saw her surplus bread going to a family instead of a dumpster, I saw people in the front row wiping their eyes. I saw my father in the third row listening, not taking notes, not analyzing, just present. And that was the culmination of more than a deal, more than a title, more than any external milestone could give. After the talk, a line formed. People wanted to shake my hand, share their own stories of waste and want, ask how they could start something similar in their communities. A woman my mother's age held my hands and said, "My daughter thinks she has a stupid idea too. I'm going to call her tonight and apologize. I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her." Later that afternoon, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, my father approached me again, this time with a lightness in his step. "I still don't fully understand every detail," he admitted, "but I understand one thing. You made this your own. And that's something rare." I smiled, gratitude spilling from a place I had once guarded tightly. "Do you remember that dinner?" I asked, "when you said leftovers aren't a real job?" He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "I remember. I was wrong." 3 words, simple, direct, unadorned. They were the 3 words I had waited 3 years to hear. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Some vindications don't require tears. They just require acknowledgement. For years I had chased external validation, funding, partnerships, press, and while those things mattered in their own arenas, this moment was something purer. Deep acknowledgement from someone whose voice once felt like the measure of success or failure. That night on the plane back home, I opened my journal and wrote simply, "Sometimes the greatest endorsement isn't applause, it's understanding." I closed my eyes and let the quiet settle in, not as relief, but as grounding. The road ahead would still be long, still unpredictable, and still full of challenges I couldn't yet see. But in that closing loop of acknowledgement from doubt to recognition, I found a strength that was deeper than any achievement or accolade. In the quiet darkness of that cabin, I understood something essential. Success without connection is hollow, but connection without success is still rich with meaning. And as I drifted toward sleep, I felt a gratitude that wasn't about triumph, but about being seen. When my phone lit up with his name later that night, I answered, not because the past demanded it, but because the present finally allowed it. We talked longer than I expected. He asked questions about the business, real questions, the kind he used to reserve for my brother's accounting career. He wanted to know how the surprise bags worked, how we kept the food safe, how many people we fed each day. I answered each one, and with each answer, I felt something shift between us. Not forgiveness exactly, because there was nothing to forgive, just understanding. The slow, patient kind that takes years to build. Before we hung up, he said something that surprised me. "Your mother wants to volunteer at one of your distribution sites. She said she wants to help pack bags." I laughed, tears suddenly pressing at the corners of my eyes. "Tell her I'll put her on the schedule." He chuckled. That might have been the first time I'd heard him laugh since I was a child. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. When the call ended, I sat alone for a moment, feeling the strange calm that comes when a story closes one of its loops. In the months that followed, success stopped feeling like a finish line and started feeling like a responsibility. The company had grown beyond anything I could have imagined in those early nights on a motorbike, and with that growth came choices that couldn't be made on instinct alone. We faced questions about expansion, about staying true to our mission while navigating markets that wanted speed over care. There were offers that glittered, but felt wrong, partnerships that promised scale at the cost of transparency. Each decision forced me to ask the same question in different forms. What does it mean to win, really? I found myself returning again and again to the earliest days, not out of nostalgia, but out of clarity. Back then, there was no strategy, no roadmap, only a refusal to look away from waste, and a stubborn belief that dignity could be designed into systems if people bothered to try. That belief became our compass. We turned down opportunities that would have made us bigger faster, but hollowed out the soul of what we were building. We said yes to slower paths that kept communities involved, that treated food not as a commodity to be flipped, but as a resource to be respected. As the company matured, my role changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. I spent less time solving problems directly and more time creating spaces where others could solve them better than I ever could. Leadership, I learned, wasn't about having the loudest voice or the sharpest answers. It was about listening until patterns emerged, about trusting people enough to let them surprise you. The same patience I had once needed from my family I now practiced with my team, understanding that belief can't be forced, only earned. One afternoon I visited a distribution hub we had opened in a city I had never lived in. The building hummed with activity crates, moving along marked paths, volunteers laughing as they worked. On one wall someone had painted a mural, a loaf of bread transforming into a network of hands passing it along. I stood there longer than I planned, watching a system I had once carried alone, now carried by hundreds. It was humbling in a way no award or headline had ever been. That evening I wrote a note to myself, the kind I used to write when doubt felt heavier than hope. It said, "Remember why you started when no one was watching. Remember the silence at the table. Remember the bag of bread in the dark." Success has a way of making beginnings feel distant, but beginnings are where the truth lives. I keep that note now folded in my wallet, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of continuity. On the anniversary of the company's founding, we held a simple gathering. No speeches, no stage, just a shared meal made entirely from food that would have been wasted the day before. Croissants from the bakery where it all began, sandwiches from the cafe that gave us our first storage space, fruit from the grocery chain that had once rejected us and now partnered with us in 3 states. My phone buzzed with the message from Rachel, a photo of her at a community garden in Portland surrounded by teenagers sorting vegetables. The caption read, "Still rescuing, just in a different way. Happy anniversary. I'm proud of what we built." I showed the photo to my father. He studied it for a moment, then asked, "Is that the one who left?" I nodded. He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "Sometimes the best people are the ones who know when to leave. Doesn't mean they didn't matter." I saved the photo to my favorites folder. Some partnerships don't last forever, but some impacts do. My father was there at the gathering, sitting among my team, listening more than he spoke. My mother was there too, wearing one of our volunteer aprons, helping arrange plates with the same quiet efficiency she had always brought to our family dinners. At one point, he caught my eye and smiled a real smile, unguarded. The table was full, and this time the silence felt like peace. The first email came from a stranger living on the other side of the country. I was knee-deep in audits and projections trying to align our systems for the next quarter. I typed a quick thanks before glancing at the subject line again. "Inspired by your story. Local Food Rescue Initiative." My eyes skimmed the words, hardly expecting anything significant. But when I opened the message, the words stopped me cold. "I started a group here in my town using your framework. We call it Too Good to Waste High School Edition. I want you to know it's changed the way we think about food in our community." I read the paragraph twice, then a third time, because it felt like someone had carved a piece of my internal monologue into real life. There were photos attached. A dozen teenagers in reflective vests, bikes loaded with baskets of bread and fruit, and on a chalkboard behind them the words, "Reduce, Rescue, Respect." I sat in silence, the hum of my laptop suddenly distant as the realization unfurled like a slow sunrise. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a story others were living too. By the time I stepped out into the crisp morning air an hour later, I had forwarded the message to half my team with the subject line, "This is why we started." It wasn't long before more messages arrived. We launched a chapter in our university. Our nonprofit is hosting a citywide food share event. Your manifesto helped us convince our town council to adopt a food rescue policy. Each message carried the same humble sincerity, the same sense of personal ownership mixed with communal purpose. One had a photo of a mom and her child at a weekend market handing out tracked surprise bags with a smile that said, "This is how we care for one another." Every day I read each of these stories with a growing sense of wonder, the kind that makes your chest expand, not with pride, but with the quiet warmth of connection. We had built a company, yes, a business operating across regions with dashboards, KPIs, and revenue models. But these were not just business letters. These were human letters. They were people who didn't care about ROI or scaling charts. They cared about purpose. Somewhere along the path from those early days on a motorbike collecting leftover bread to now I had stopped seeing impact as something external, something measured in contracts or funding rounds. Impact had become living flesh emanating from people's choices. Individuals who said, "I will do this because it matters." In one video I received a group of high schoolers unfurled a colorful banner at a farmer's market that read, "Leftovers are potential." That phrase, simple, poetic, hopeful, echoed in my mind for days. These were not just followers of a model. They were interpreters of meaning. They had reshaped the idea into their own context, their own understanding of how to serve their communities, their own versions of dignity and connection. I began to see myself in them not as the original author of an idea, but as part of a collective story. I saw my early nights of loneliness reflected in the tired but determined eyes of a volunteer coordinator in a rural county. I saw my anxieties in the cautious optimism of a small business owner who had adapted the model for his cafe. I saw my hope in the beaming smile of a child distributing her first rescued sandwich. Then came an invitation that made me pause. A national forum on social innovation wanted me to speak. Not about our company's financial results, not about revenue projections, but about how small actions lead to systemic change. So I accepted the invitation. On the day of the event, I stood at the podium, looking out into an auditorium that pulsed with energy. I wasn't there to sell anything. I wasn't there to recruit investors. I was there to share a truth that had grown deep roots in me. Change doesn't start in boardrooms, I said. It starts in tiny, unglamorous moments, in the act of noticing what most people ignore, in the torn seam of a trash bag, in the hesitation of someone deciding whether to take a surprise bag, in the rhythm of people choosing to show up. I spoke of beginnings and missteps of contracts and controversies of departures and arrivals. And then I spoke of the messages. The emails from strangers living lives touched by the work, the photos from far-off places, the reinterpretations in high school assemblies and city policy forums. When I mentioned the teenagers with their reflective vests and chalkboard message, there was a murmur in the audience, not of doubt, but of resonance. I realized then that impact is not linear. It does not unfold only in the places we designate as strategic. It echoes in every direction. It flourishes where it is given soil, and sometimes that soil is an open heart rather than a well-funded ledger. Afterward, in the quiet of the backstage waiting area, my phone buzzed again. A message from a teacher I had never met. "Your story inspired my students to start their own zero-waste garden project." And beneath it, a photo of children kneeling in soil planting seeds that would grow into food. Food that might one day not be wasted but harvested, shared, celebrated. I stared at that photo, the small buds against rich earth, and a thought came unbidden. This isn't just impact. This is a legacy. Not mine, not theirs, but something shared. Some days I still wonder if I deserve how far this has gone. I closed my eyes, breathed, and let the joy ripple through me. Not the shallow joy of acclaim, but the deep joy of interconnection. The sense that a thought can become many thoughts, a gesture can become many gestures, a single idea can become a constellation. When people ask me now what the secret was, how an idea everyone laughed at became something real, I don't give them a formula. I tell them there was no moment when it suddenly made sense, no guarantee that the risk would pay off. There was only a series of choices made without applause, guided by a quiet insistence that meaning matters. I tell them that being underestimated is not a curse if you're willing to do the work in the shadows. I tell them that the world doesn't need more perfect plans. It needs more people willing to start with what they have and learn out loud. Sometimes late at night I think about that first dinner again, not with bitterness but with a strange affection for the person I was then, sitting silently holding an idea no one else could see. The company is valued now in numbers that make headlines, but those numbers are not what sustain me. What sustains me are the messages from people who say they see food differently now, who say they feel less ashamed asking for help, who say they started something small because they saw someone else do it first. What sustains me is the knowledge that a dismissive laugh didn't get the last word. I don't know what the next chapter holds. I've learned not to pretend I do, but I know this much. The path forward doesn't require permission from the past. It requires honesty, persistence, and the humility to keep learning. The story didn't end when the company became successful. It deepened. And if there is a final lesson in all of this, it is simple and hard at the same time. The things worth building rarely look like jobs at first. They look like questions no one else is asking yet. If you're holding a question no one else is asking yet, this might be your moment. And if this story felt familiar, tell me what people laughed at when you first said it out loud.